Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we are diving into psychological research. So, think about this. Every single day, you're flooded with headlines, posts on social media, advice from friends, maybe even a TikTok that starts with "Science says, enter topic here." But here's the question: how do you know if any of it's actually true? That's where psychology steps in. Psychology is a science because it relies on research, careful, systematic, evidence-based methods. That's how we're able to answer questions about how people think, how they feel, and how they behave. By the end of this chapter, you'll not only understand what those methods are, but also why they matter for everyday life. Learning about research doesn't just make you a better psychology student, it helps make you a smarter consumer of information. So, as we move through this, I want you to keep in mind when I hear a claim about mental health, about behavior, or about people in general, what would it take for me to trust it? So, let's start with a simple question. Why is research important? How do you know what you know? Maybe you believe something because your parents told you, or maybe you saw it online, or maybe it just feels right. But feelings, opinions, and even personal experiences can be misleading. For example, imagine a friend tells you that drinking an energy drink before an exam will help you remember more. Would you believe them? Some of you might say, yeah, I've tried it and it worked for me. Others might be unsure. So, how do we find out what's actually true? And that's where research comes in. Psychology is a science. We don't rely on hunches or personal stories. We use careful, systematic research to test our ideas. Research is what moves us from "I think" to "I know" with evidence. And that's why it matters. Research keeps us from being misled. It cuts through myths, stereotypes, and even well-meaning advice. It's the backbone of psychology. The way big questions about human behavior become knowledge we can trust. Alrighty, so let's talk about how psychologists actually do research. At the heart of it is something you probably heard of before, is the scientific method. Now, that phrase can be really intimidating, but it's really just a structured way of asking questions and making sure our answers are based on evidence and not just guesses. So think of it like a roadmap that helps keep us from getting lost in our assumptions. Within this process, researchers use two important kinds of reasoning: inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. But what's the difference between the two? Inductive reasoning is when we start with a specific observation and then build a broader idea from that. For example, let's say you notice several classmates who pulled all-nighters before an exam didn't do so well. You might think, maybe lack of sleep hurts our memory. That is induction, moving from what you've seen into a bigger picture. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, flips it around, so it starts with a general principle and applies it to specific situations. So if research already shows that a lack of sleep reduces our memory, then you might predict, okay, my roommate who stayed up until 4 this morning is probably going to struggle on today's quiz. That's deductive, taking a general rule and applying it to a case. So how does that fit into psychology? That's where the scientific method comes in. So let's walk through this in everyday terms. So first, we ask ourselves a question or we identify the problem, like does sleep affect test performance? Next, we form a hypothesis, which is an educated guess that we can test. For example, students who sleep less than 5 hours will score lower on exams than students who sleep 7 or more hours. Then we design a study, deciding who to study, how to measure sleep, and how to measure test scores. After that, we collect the data, maybe through surveys, lab tests, classroom observation. Then comes the math part. We analyze the data using statistics to see if the results are really supported, if they really support our hypothesis. And then from there, we draw conclusions. Did the results confirm our idea or not? And what does that mean for psychology as a field? And then we report our results. Researchers publish their findings in journals or present them at conferences so others can evaluate, replicate, or even challenge the work. This process makes research transparent and repeatable. If another scientist follows the same steps and finds the same results, that strengthens the evidence. But if they don't get the same outcome, that raises new questions and pushes the science forward. So the scientific method isn't just a checklist, it's what helps keep researchers grounded in evidence and open to correction. So a theory is a big picture explanation. It's broad. For example, a theory might say sleep is important for learning. That gives us a framework to think about, but it doesn't give us something we can directly measure in an experiment. A hypothesis, on the other hand, zooms in and gets much more specific. It's a testable prediction, usually written as an if-then statement. For example, if students get less than 5 hours of sleep, then their test scores will be lower than those who sleep 7 or more hours. See that difference? The theory gives us the big idea, while the hypothesis tells us exactly what we can test. So now that we understand why research is important, let's dive into how researchers actually study behavior. Psychology is such a huge field, and the topics are all over the place, from memory, emotion, and perception to social interactions and abnormal behavior. Because of this, psychologists use a variety of research approaches, each suited to different questions. So let's start with the oldest research method in psychology, the case study. A case study is when researchers take an in-depth look at one individual, or sometimes a very, very small group. This method is especially useful when we're studying something rare, unusual, or extreme, because those situations don't show up often enough to study in large groups. One of the most famous studies is Phineas Gage. Back in 1848, he was a railroad worker who survived a terrible accident. A metal rod actually went through his skull, and amazingly, he lived. But people around him noticed big changes in his personality. Researchers studied him closely, and his case gave us early clues about the role of the frontal lobes in decision-making and personality. That one case opened the door to understanding how brain injury can affect our behavior. Case studies are still used today. For example, a psychologist might work closely with a child prodigy or someone who has an extremely rare disorder, documenting as much as possible to learn from that unique situation. Another interesting example is Jeannie. Jeannie was studied by psychologists after she was found at age 13, having suffered severe abuse and social isolation. Psychologists were interested in the effect social isolation had on her development. It's pretty cool to look at and to understand. So let's tie this into Freud's work. If you look at this figure here on the slide, you'll see Freud's famous iceberg model of the mind. Freud relied heavily on case studies of his patients to explore how the unconscious mind might shape behavior. According to his model, the conscious mind is like the tip of the iceberg, the thoughts that you're aware of right now listening to this lecture. Just below the surface is the preconscious, things like memories that you can bring into awareness when you need to. And then deep below the waterline is the unconscious, thoughts, memories, and desires that influence us without us even realizing it. Case studies are a starting point. They're not the final answer. Freud's case studies gave him ideas that later influenced theories in more structured research. Case studies can suggest possible explanations, but they can't prove them. They're valuable because they generate hypotheses that other researchers can later test in bigger, more controlled studies. Another research method psychologists use is naturalistic observation. This is all about watching behavior as it naturally occurs, without interfering or letting people know that they're being studied. The goal is to see what people or animals actually do in the real world, rather than how they act when they know someone is watching. A classic example is Jane Goodall, who spent decades observing chimpanzees in the wild. By studying them in their natural habitat, she discovered behaviors like using sticks as tools that would have never appeared in a laboratory setting. Those observations completely changed how scientists understood primate intelligence. Naturalistic observation isn't just for animals, though. Psychologists often use it with humans as well. For instance, a researcher might watch how children play together on a playground, noticing patterns in cooperation, conflict, or social interaction, without the kids knowing they're being observed. That way, the behavior is genuine, not influenced by someone standing over them with a clipboard. It's also important to know that we need clear criteria for what's being observed. Otherwise, researchers might fall into the trap of seeing what they expect to see rather than what's actually happening. Clear definitions help make observations objective and reliable, which is essential for solid research. Surveys are one of the fastest ways for psychologists to gather information from a lot of people at once. They're especially useful when researchers want to know about opinions, beliefs, or behaviors that people can report themselves. For example, psychologists might use surveys to study social media habits, sleep routines, or favorite study techniques. The great thing about surveys is that they can reach hundreds or thousands of people, which gives researchers a sample that can represent a much larger population. That's how we start to see patterns and trends that are meaningful beyond just one group of participants. Here's something to think about. Have you ever filled out an online survey? Did you take your time and answer honestly, or did you rush through it? That matters because the accuracy of the survey data depends on participants being truthful and thoughtful. If people aren't careful, it can skew the results and affect what researchers conclude. So surveys are powerful, but they're only as good as the responses people give and the questions that the researchers ask. Another research method psychologists use is archival research. Unlike surveys or experiments, archival research doesn't involve collecting new data from participants. Instead, researchers dig into existing records or data to look for patterns, trends, or relationships. For example, a researcher might examine school records to see whether attendance is linked to academic performance. Or they could analyze historical crime data to study behavior patterns over decades. Even social media posts or tweets can provide valuable insights into trends in public opinion or mental health. One of the reasons archival research is so useful is that it's often faster and less expensive than gathering new data. It also lets researchers study large populations over large periods of time without waiting for new events to occur. And because the data already exists, many ethical and practical challenges are minimized. Sometimes researchers want to understand how people change over time. Maybe they want to know how early experiences affect later outcomes or how behaviors develop across the lifespan. To answer these kinds of questions, researchers often turn to longitudinal or cross-sectional research. So let's start with longitudinal research. This method involves studying the same group of people over a long period of time. One classic example might be following children from kindergarten through high school to see how early social skills influence later academic performance. You could imagine researchers checking in every year to measure things like friendships, self-confidence, and grades. Over time, this helps psychologists to see patterns of growth, setbacks, or stability. Longitudinal studies are also used in health research, like tracking people's diets and exercise habits to see how lifestyle in early adulthood affects heart health decades later. The big advantage is that you can observe how individuals change over time, but it does take a lot of time, effort, and money. Cross-sectional research, on the other hand, is more like taking a snapshot. Instead of following the same people, researchers compare different groups at a single point in time. For example, a psychologist might look at memory performance in teenagers, adults, and seniors all at once to see how it varies by age. Another real-world example could be studying attitudes towards technology by comparing high school students, college students, and older adults today, rather than following each group over years. Cross-sectional studies are faster and easier to conduct, but they don't track individual changes over time, so they can't tell us how a person's behavior evolves. Both methods are powerful tools depending on the question. Longitudinal research is like reading a full story from beginning to end, while cross-sectional research is like glancing at a few pages from different chapters. Together, they do help researchers understand both change and differences in human behavior. Once researchers collect data, the next big step is making sense of it. Analyzing allows research to see whether their results support their hypotheses and if patterns are meaningful. So let's look at the different tools researchers or psychologists use when analyzing their findings. So we have correlations. A correlation simply means that two variables are related to each other in some way. But remember, just because two things are related doesn't automatically mean one causes the other. There are two main types of correlations. A positive correlation happens when both variables increase or decrease together. For example, the more hours you study, the higher your exam score tends to be. Or the more hours you spend exercising each week, the better your overall health might be. In both cases, as one goes up, the other goes up as well. A negative correlation happens when one variable increases while the other one decreases. For instance, the more time someone spends scrolling TikTok late at night, the fewer hours of sleep they're likely to get. Another example could be the more absences a student has, the lower their class grade tends to be. In these cases, as one goes up, the other goes down. Correlations are useful because they help researchers identify patterns in behavior. For example, if researchers notice a correlation between loneliness and depression, it signals that these two experiences are related and worth studying further. But again, correlation does not equal causation. Just because the things are linked doesn't mean one directly causes the other. Now, let's take a look at cause and effect relationships. A cause and effect relationship happens when we can say for sure that changing one thing directly changes another. In psychology research, this means that the independent variable, which is what we manipulate, produces a change in the dependent variable, which is what we measure. Confounding variables are factors outside that sneak in and influence both the independent and dependent variables, creating the illusion of a cause and effect relationship. So, for example, imagine a study that shows that students who sleep more get better grades. Seems simple, right? But what if there's a hidden third factor, like stress? Maybe students who sleep more also feel less stressed, and it's the lower stress that really boosts their grades. Another example is, let's say researchers find a link between exercise and happiness. That sounds good. But what if the weather is the hidden confound? People who are more likely to exercise on sunny days also tend to feel happier on those days. Researchers have to be very careful to control for confounding variables, whether through random assignment, keeping procedures standardized, or using statistics to adjust for outside influences. Without that, you might think you found a cause when really it's just a coincidence or a third factor at work. An illusory correlation happens when we believe two things are connected, even though they really aren't. A classic example is the idea that a full moon makes people act strangely. Emergency rooms and police stations and myself often say that they see more activity during a full moon. But when researchers actually look at the data, there's no connection at all. Our brains just love to spot patterns, even when they don't exist. These kinds of correlations can have bigger consequences too. They can fuel stereotypes. So, for instance, if someone sees one negative behavior from a member of a group, they might assume that behavior is typical of the whole group. That false connection can feed prejudice and even discrimination. With confirmation bias, this is our tendency to notice or remember information that supports what we already believe while ignoring evidence that doesn't quite fit. For example, if you believe Mondays are unlucky, you'll probably remember every flat tire, bad grade, or spilled coffee that happens on a Monday. But you'll forget all of the Mondays that went just fine. In research, confirmation bias can be especially dangerous because it can lead researchers to pick data that supports their hypothesis instead of considering the full picture. Both of these, illusory correlations and confirmation bias, show that our brains are pattern-seeking machines, wired to look for connection, which helps make sense of the world. But sometimes that eagerness goes too far and leads to conclusions that just aren't accurate. Can you think of a time when you ignored evidence because it didn't fit your belief? All right, so now we're moving into how researchers actually test for cause and effect. Remember, just because two things aren't related doesn't mean that one caused the other. The only way we can really test cause and effect is through an experiment. In an experiment, we have two groups. The experimental group, which receives the treatment or manipulation, and the control group, which does not. So for example, let's say we want to test whether caffeine improves our memory. Our experimental group drinks caffeinated coffee, while our control group gets decaf. If the caffeinated group recalls more words on a memory test than the decaf group, and everything else was controlled, we can say definitively that caffeine caused better memory performance. Operational definitions. So an operational definition is basically a clear, specific description of how we're going to measure something or how we're going to apply the manipulation. Psychologists or researchers can't just say, I'm studying study habits or testing happiness. Those are too vague. We need to define them in a way that any other researcher could measure the exact same way and get comparable results. So for example, instead of saying study habits, I might define it operationally as the number of hours a student spends reviewing flashcards each week. That way it's measurable and precise. Or let's say I want to test whether exercise improves our mood. I can't just say mood, that's way too broad. Instead, I might define mood as a participant's score on a standardized mood questionnaire, or even something like the number of positive words they use in a journal entry. Why does this matter? Because if researchers don't define things clearly, no one can replicate the study, and psychology is about replication. Operational definitions help make our science reliable. This is also why researchers use blinding. In a single blind study, participants don't know whether they're in the experimental group or the control group. In a double-blind study, neither the participants nor the researchers know how the data is collected, or until after the data is collected. That way, neither expectations from participants nor unintentional bias from the researcher can skew the results. So when you hear about drug trials, this is why people in the control group sometimes get a sugar pill. It's not to trick them for fun, it's to make sure we can really separate the effect of the drug from the effect of the belief. But there's the catch. People's expectations can actually influence results. That's called the placebo effect. A placebo is something that looks like the real treatment but isn't, like a sugar pill or a decaf coffee disguised as regular. The crazy part is that people sometimes improve simply because they believe they're going to get the treatment. For example, if someone thinks they're drinking an energy drink, they might feel more alert, even if it's just flavored water. We also have independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is what the researcher changes, and the dependent variable is what they're measuring. Researchers change the independent variable to see how it affects the dependent one. For example, if you study how sleep affects memory, hours of sleep is the independent variable, and memory test scores are the dependent variable. Controlling these things makes the results more trustworthy. So now let's talk about who actually takes part in research. The people who participate are called participants. Since researchers usually can't study an entire population, they use a sample, which is a smaller group meant to represent the larger population. We have random sampling. One way to make sure that sample represents the population is through random sampling. So this means every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. Why does that matter? Well, because it reduces bias and makes findings more generalizable. For example, if I only surveyed my friends about social media use, That's not a fair sample of the whole population. But if I randomly draw names from a hat, that would give everyone an equal shot. Now, once we have our participants, the next step is random assignment. This is different from random sampling. Random assignment means every participant has an equal chance of being placed in either the experimental group or the control group. Well, and that matters because it makes sure that the two groups start out as similarly as possible. If one group is already stronger, smarter, or healthier than the other, then the results could be misleading or skewed. For example, imagine we're testing whether caffeine improves memory. If we let participants choose their group, the coffee lovers would all pile into the caffeine group. Those students might already be more alert, which would skew the results. But with random assignment, like flipping a coin, we spread participants fairly between the two groups. That way, if the caffeine group outperforms the decaf group, we can be much more confident it's the caffeine that made the difference. After random assignment, researchers manipulate variables to test cause and effect, but not every variable can be manipulated. For example, the effect of sex, male versus female, for example, on spatial memory. Sex is an independent variable, but participants can't be randomly assigned to their gender. This type of research design is called a quasi-experimental. It looks like an experiment, but because random assignment isn't possible, we can't make strong cause and effect conclusions. And here's where ethics comes in. Some things simply cannot be studied experimentally because they would be unethical. For example, we could never randomly assign participants to experience childhood abuse just to study its effects on self-esteem. Instead, researchers would have to use methods like case studies, surveys, or correlational research to investigate those kinds of questions. Once an experiment is complete, researchers can't just glance at the results and say, yep, looks good. They use something called statistical analysis to figure out whether the findings are meaningful or if they might have just happened by random chance. So here's the key rule. If the odds that the results occurred by chance are 5% or less, we can call that result a statistically significant result. That means we can be pretty confident that the effect we observed was due to the manipulation of the independent variable, not just luck. For example, if students who studied with music scored 2% higher on a test compared to those who studied in silence, that's probably not meaningful. But if they scored 20% higher, now we're more likely looking at a significant difference. True experiments, those that include random assignment, manipulation of variables, and control of extra factors, help reduce the chance that results are random. Now, once researchers interpret the results, what do they do? What do they do with them? They don't just post them on TikTok or in a blog. Instead, they share them in scientific journals. These journals are written for other psychologists, researchers, and professionals, not the general public. The purpose is to build collective knowledge, get feedback, and let other scientists build on their work. For example, a study on mindfulness and stress might be published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, so other experts can learn from it, critique it, and even try to expand on it. But here's the catch. Before a journal publishes a study, it has to go through a peer review. This means other experts in the field carefully review the research before it's accepted. They look at things like, is the study well designed and logical? Are the methods and results clear and accurate? Could someone else replicate the study with the information provided? And are there weaknesses or improvements that need to be addressed? This process acts as quality control. For example, if someone submits a study claiming video games cause aggression, reviewers might point out that they need to control for age, gender, or prior aggression before the results can be really trusted. Peer review helps filter out weak, misleading research before it gets published. Even after peer review, science isn't considered settled after just one study. Other researchers will often attempt to replicate the study, to repeat it and see if the same results occur. Replication is powerful because it confirms reliability. If researchers find the same effect, like smiling increasing positive mood, across different groups and cultures, then we can be more confident that it's real. But replication can also reveal problems. If results don't hold up, researchers may have to rethink the original claim. This is one of the strengths of science, it's self-correcting. No single study determines truth forever. Instead, replication keeps psychology grounded in reliable and repeatable evidence. So here's a real-world example. So even with peer review and replication, science isn't perfect. Sometimes flawed research makes it through the cracks and captures public attention. A good example of this is that vaccines and autism controversy. Back in the late 1990s, a few peer-reviewed articles suggested that routine childhood vaccines might cause autism in some children. The media picked it up, and fear spread quickly among parents. But here's what went wrong. Large-scale follow-up studies found no link between vaccines and autism. Many of the early studies were retracted by journals because of serious methodological and ethical flaws. And investigations revealed that the lead researcher had financial conflicts of interest. He would profit if vaccines were seen as unsafe. The problem is, once fear spreads, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. Even though the science overwhelmingly shows that vaccines are safe, a lot of people still believe the original false claim. This case really highlights why replication, transparency, and critical evaluation are so important. Science isn't just about producing one exciting result, it's about making sure that results hold up under careful testing and review. When conducting research, researchers don't just want results, they want results they can trust. Two key concepts in evaluating research are reliability and validity. Reliability is all about consistency, getting the same results under the same conditions. Think of it like the bathroom scale. If you step on it 3 times in a row, you'd expect it to give the exact same number each time. If it jumps around wildly, you wouldn't trust it. The same principle applies in psychology. For example, if several observers are watching kids in a classroom and noting aggressive behavior, they need to record events in a consistent way. That way, we know the results reflect what actually happened, not just the observer's personal judgment. Now, a related concept is inter-rater reliability. This measures how much agreement there is among different observers. For example, imagine there's 3 researchers watching the same lesson and counting instances of helpful behavior. High inter-rater reliability means all 3 observers classify and record the behaviors similarly. Without this, results might reflect personal biases rather than the true behavior of the students. Inter-rater reliability ensures we can trust that what we're measuring is real and not just a product of who is doing the observing. Validity is about accuracy, whether a measurement truly measures what it's supposed to measure. A valid measure is always reliable because it has to be consistent to be meaningful. But just because something is reliable doesn't mean it's valid. For instance, if a scale always reads 5 pounds heavier than your actual weight, it's reliable. You get the same number each time, but it's not valid because it's not accurate. In psychology, a test meant to measure anxiety should actually capture anxiety symptoms, not unrelated traits like shyness or introversion. Just because we can study something, does that mean that we should? Ethics in research is all about making sure our studies are conducted responsibly, safely, and with respect to participants. It's the rulebook that protects people and animals from harm, and it ensures that the knowledge we gain doesn't come at an unacceptable cost. As we explore research methods, keep that in mind. Ethical considerations are not just a formality, they're the central, integral part of psychology. So why is ethics so important in research? Because participants are real people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Without clear ethical guidelines, studies could unintentionally cause harm, trauma, or misuse of private information. That's why psychology has strict rules in place, many of which were established because of historical abuses, like the Tuskegee syphilis study, where participants were misled and denied treatment. Cases like that taught the field a hard lesson. Ethical safeguards are essential. This is where the institutional review boards, or IRBs, come in. Every research project involving humans has to be reviewed by an IRB before it starts. These boards aren't just made up of scientists, they include non-scientists, and community members as well. Their job is to weigh the risks and benefits of a study, ensure vulnerable populations like children or prisoners are protected, and make sure informed consent is handled correctly. So, what is informed consent? Participants must know exactly what they're signing up for. They need to understand the purpose of the study, what they are going to be asked to do, any potential risks or discomforts, and their right to withdraw at any time. Importantly, this information should be presented in a clear and simple way. For example, if a study involves sleep deprivation, participants must be told that they might feel tired, irritable, or unfocused, so they can make an informed choice about actually participating or not. Finally, privacy and confidentiality are key. Researchers must protect personal information, store data securely, and often remove identifying details so individual participants cannot be recognized. For instance, if you took part in a study on anxiety, your name would not appear in the published results. Only group averages would. These safeguards ensure that while science advances, the dignity and safety of participants comes first. So there is also a tricky part of research: deception and debriefing. Sometimes researchers can't reveal all of the details of a study up front because knowing the full purpose might change how participants behave. For example, if people knew a study was measuring how often they interrupt others, they might consciously hold back, and the results wouldn't reflect natural behavior. But there are strict ethical rules around this. Any deception has to be minimal and fully justified. Researchers cannot lie just for convenience. Participants also cannot be harmed or experience distress because of the deception. Once the study is over, researchers must debrief participants, which means explaining the true purpose of the study, what the deception involved, and why it was necessary. These steps help restore trust, ensures transparency, and lets participants leave the study fully informed. So even when researchers need to bend the rules a little bit for scientific purposes, ethics still guide every step of the way to protect the people that are involved. So to understand why this is so critical, we need to look at that historical example, the Tuskegee syphilis study. The study began in 1932 and involved hundreds of African American men who had syphilis. The researchers wanted to study the natural progression of the disease, but the shocking part was that the men were never told they had syphilis. And even after penicillin became the standard treatment in the 1940s, they were not treated. The participants were misled. They were told they were receiving free health care for bad blood, but in reality, they were being observed as the disease progressed. This caused real harm. Many men died, and the infection spread to their families. It's a clear example of how research without ethics can exploit people and create lasting trauma. The Tuskegee study led to major changes in research regulations in the United States. So today we do have those strict guidelines, IRBs, and informed consent requirements to make sure nothing like this never happens again. It's a sobering reminder that ethics aren't just rules on paper, they are there to help protect people. Sometimes researchers need to study questions that can't be safely or ethically tested with humans. That's where animal research comes in. For example, studying the effects of brain injury or certain drug interactions might be impossible to test in people, so researchers turn to animals to help us out. But this doesn't mean researchers can do whatever they want. There are also strict rules and ethical guidelines to ensure animals are treated humanely. This includes proper housing, access to clean food and water, and veterinary care when necessary. Pain and suffering must be minimalized, and experiments using animals can only be done when there are no alternative methods to answer the research question. Oversight comes from the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. This committee reviews all proposed research involving animals to make sure it's justified, humane, and compliant with regulations. Think of it as the animal research equivalent of an IRB for human participants. Ethical animal research allows scientists to learn valuable information about behavior, cognition, and biology while respecting the welfare of animals involved. For instance, studies on learning and memory in rats have helped us understand how the human brain forms habits and stores information, which has real-world applications for education and therapy. So that's it for Chapter 2. We've seen how research helps psychologists and researchers move from ideas to evidence, how experiments are designed, how we interpret the results, and why ethics are so important. Psychology is a science, and this is the foundation that helps keep it rigorous and responsible.